What happens when your body no longer belongs to you? For King Charles II, that meant having his head shaved, blood drained, blistered with red-hot irons, and his throat scorched, all in the name of medicine. For Elmer McCurdy, it meant being mummified, spray-painted neon, and treated like a coat rack for decades after he was gone. They were from different worlds and different centuries, but they shared one sick reality. Death didn't bring them peace, it just made them property. These are the shocking true stories of two of the most disrespected bodies in human history. In 1976, a Hollywood film crew was setting up a set in a carnival funhouse. As they were moving a neon orange wax mannequin prop that was hanging from a noose, the arm snapped off in the producer's hand. But it didn't break like plastic. It snapped like dry wood. The crew expected to see cheap, broken plastic, but what the producer was holding in his hand wasn't a prop. It was the arm of a man who had been dead for 66 years. The TV production crew was filming an episode of The $6 Million Man inside a rundown amusement park in Long Beach, California. The episode was called Carnival of Spies, and it required a dark, unsettling carnival environment, which made the location an easy choice. The attraction was called Laugh in the Dark. It was a funhouse filled with outdated props, flickering lights, and old dusty decorations that no one had bothered to replace in years. And among those decorations was a hanging prop. It was life-sized, stiff, and slightly discolored, just like an old mannequin. It was slumped and it hung from a noose. The production crew didn't think twice about it. They assumed it was just another cheap horror prop, until someone tried to move it. As a crew member reached up to reposition the figure, the arm snapped off at the shoulder. The set went completely silent as they realized it wasn't a mannequin at all. Muscle tissue was still visible inside the break. The arm had snapped clean off like an old piece of wood, exposing bone. Real human bone. Filming stopped immediately, and the authorities were called. What the crew had assumed was a mannequin turned out to be a real human corpse that had been hanging inside the funhouse for years. Inside the mouth, investigators found two baffling clues: a 1924 penny and a ticket stub from a traveling sideshow dating back to the 1920s. The body belonged to Elmer McCurdy, a man whose discovery raised the chilling question: how does a human being end up as a plastic carnival prop? To answer that, you have to go back more than 60 years, with a man who was arguably the most incompetent outlaw in the American history. This guy makes the wet bandits from Home Alone look like certified geniuses. In the storied history of Wild West outlaws, most bandits are remembered for their daring heists and bravery. But McCurdy isn't remembered for his crimes. He's remembered for his total lack of talent. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a walking disaster who couldn't even break the law correctly. Elmer McCurdy was born in 1880 in Washington, Maine. He grew up poor, he drifted from place to place, and he worked a series of jobs that never quite worked out. But eventually, he joined the US Army, where he learned how to use explosives, including nitroglycerin. This training would later convince McCurdy that he was qualified to become an outlaw, but history would disagree. After leaving the military, McCurdy headed west and settled briefly in Oklahoma. And like many struggling men at the turn of the 20th century, McCurdy started to believe that crime might be easier than honest work. He wanted to be an outlaw, but someone forgot to tell him he wasn't very good at it. Elmer McCurdy desperately wanted to become a legend, but he had one small problem. He was almost comically bad at crime. During one heist, he attempted to blast open a safe using his nitroglycerin training from the Army. But Elmer wasn't great with explosives, and he butchered the job. He used so much nitro that he didn't just open the safe, he blew up the coins inside, melting $40,000 worth of silver coins directly into the metal walls. He'd technically broken in, but he made the coins inside completely worthless. But McCurdy was unfazed. He eventually went after the big one, a train rumored to be carrying $400,000 in government payments. It was supposed to be a life-changing, retirement-level heist, but in classic Elmer fashion, he stopped the wrong train. So instead of the treasure chest of gold he expected, he mistakenly boarded a passenger train, walking away with $46 and 2 jugs of whiskey. Most outlaws leave behind a legacy of fear and respect. Elmer McCurdy left behind a pile of melted silver and a very confused sheriff. If there was an award for the worst outlaws in history, Elmer wouldn't have just won it. He would have accidentally blown up the trophy. Despite his string of failures, McCurdy refused to quit, but eventually the law caught up with him and a bounty was issued on his head. In October of 1911, a sheriff's posse finally tracked him to a hayloft in Oklahoma. They surrounded the barn, calling for his surrender, but Elmer knew this was his final chance at a heroic outlaw moment, and he refused to go quietly. A frantic shootout erupted in the darkness, and when the smoke finally cleared, the 31-year-old lay dead with a single bullet wound to his chest. That should have been the end of the story. But for Elmer McCurdy, death wasn't the end of the line. It was the beginning of his world tour. McCurdy's body was taken to a funeral home in Oklahoma. No family came forward to claim him, and in the early 1900s, it was common for undertakers to embalm unclaimed bodies heavily while waiting for burial arrangements. So McCurdy was embalmed, heavily. Days passed, then weeks. No one claimed the body. The undertaker decided he wasn't going to eat the cost of preserving the body himself, so he made a business decision. McCurdy's body was dressed in street clothes. A rifle was placed in his hands, and he was propped upright inside the funeral home. A sign was posted next to him, advertising him as the Wild West bandit who wouldn't give up. Visitors were charged a nickel to see him, and the coins were dropped directly into his mouth. McCurdy was finally gaining the notoriety and riches he desperately wanted. It's just too bad he wasn't alive to see it. Then in 1916, two men arrived at the funeral home claiming to be Elmer McCurdy's long-lost brothers. They said they wanted to give him a proper burial, so the undertaker handed over the body. But the men weren't his brothers. They weren't relatives at all. They were carnival promoters. They'd heard of the bandit who wouldn't give up, and they knew they could make a pretty penny from his corpse. Instead of burying McCurdy, they placed him into a traveling sideshow. He was advertised as a real American outlaw, preserved and upright. He'd finally achieved what he was never able to manage in real life. He became a legendary outlaw. And from that moment on, Elmer McCurdy began his second life, one that would last far longer than his first. For the next 60 years, Elmer McCurdy did more traveling as a corpse than he ever did as a living man. He became a permanent fixture in the American carnival circuit. He bounced between traveling carnivals, dusty wax museums, and roadside horror attractions. Ownership changed hands repeatedly, and the original story blurred into legend. But as the decades passed, his preserved corpse began to fail. His fingers snapped off, his toes eventually crumbled, his ears vanished entirely. So to keep the attraction viewer-friendly, owners layered him in thick wax and coats of neon paint. They patched his deteriorating frame until he looked less like a human being and more like a mannequin. By the time he reached his final destination inside the funhouse, the paperwork was long gone, and the truth about Elmer McCurdy had been buried. Everyone involved had forgotten one detail that mattered the most. The prop hanging from the noose wasn't a masterpiece of art. It was a real person. By the time the 1970s arrived, Elmer McCurdy had transitioned from a star attraction to a forgotten prop. He was no longer the bandit who wouldn't give up. He was coated in fluorescent paint and hung from a noose inside the Laugh in the Dark funhouse in Long Beach, California. And for years, thousands of screaming teenagers walked right past him, never realizing that the mannequin in the corner was actually a man in the corner. The legend finally ended in 1976 when that television crew for the $6 Million Man arrived to film. When investigators finally performed the most overdue autopsy in history, they found more than just a 65-year-old gunshot wound. Wedged inside Elmer's mouth, as if he were some sort of gumball machine, were two final clues, a 1924 penny and a ticket stub from a 1920s sideshow. After 66 years of being sold, painted, and ignored, Elmer McCurdy was finally more than just a prop. He was recognized as a person again. In 1977, Elmer McCurdy was finally laid to rest in Oklahoma. A judge ordered that 2 feet of concrete be poured over his casket to keep him from ever being taken advantage of again. Elmer McCurdy failed miserably as an outlaw, but in death, he succeeded as a tourist attraction, a movie prop, a TV show extra, and a historical punchline. His story is real, it's documented, and it's one of the clearest examples of how absurd reality can become. In 1685, King Charles II fell ill. What happened next would become one of the most unusual string of events in medical history, one that blurs the line between medical care and torture. King Charles II of England died in February of 1685, and the kingdom was shocked. Rumors spread quickly after the king's sudden death. Some whispered of poisoning, others suspected political revenge. Charles II had lived through exile, civil war, and the execution of his own father. He had many enemies everywhere. And King Charles wasn't old. He hadn't been fighting any serious illness. Although he suffered from gout and joint pain, he was still active and mentally sharp. And just days earlier, he'd been walking, talking, and carrying out his normal duties as ruler of England. And then suddenly, he was gone. England wanted answers. What they got instead was one of the most extreme examples of medical care ever documented. King Charles was bled, burned, poisoned, purged, blistered, cupped, shaved, enemaed, force-fed, and chemically assaulted for 4 straight days by the most elite physicians money and royalty could buy. They put this man through the ringer, and they documented every moment of it. Their notes were meant to prove that Charles had received the finest medical care available. What those records showed instead revealed something else entirely. This is sick history. On the morning of February 2nd, 1685, 54-year-old King Charles woke up feeling sick. He wasn't frail or bedridden, and he wasn't dying. He was shaving. And without warning, the king cried out and collapsed. Witnesses said his body fell into violent convulsions. His speech became confused. His body stiffened. He began to lose control of his muscles. The King of England lay on the floor, barely conscious. And that's the moment King Charles went from bad to worse. Today, doctors believe he likely suffered a seizure or a stroke that was caused by kidney disease that had been building for years. But in 1685, doctors didn't think that way. They believed illness came from an imbalance inside the body. At the time, European medicine was based on ideas from the ancient Greek physician Galen. And according to Galenic theory, the body was controlled by 4 fluids, called humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was a balance of these fluids, disease was an imbalance. The king's convulsions were seen as a sign that bad humors were attacking his brain. So the solution was simple: remove them. Within minutes of his collapse, the first doctor arrived on the scene, and he did what elite medicine had been teaching for centuries. He opened a vein. About a pint of blood was drained from the king's arm immediately, and at the time, bloodletting wasn't considered dangerous. It was one of the most common medical treatments for nearly every single illness. As more physicians arrived, more blood was removed. Heated glass cups were placed on the king's skin to create suction blisters, a practice known as cupping. Small cuts were made beneath the cups to encourage bleeding. By the end of the first day, Charles had lost a significant amount of blood. He was pale and weak. His doctors saw this as a good sign. They believed the treatment was working. It wasn't. The king's condition worsened, so the doctors took his treatments to the next level. When bleeding failed to restore the king, the doctors turned to purging. Charles was forced to swallow antimony, which is a toxic metal compound known to cause violent vomiting. Antimony doesn't heal you, it poisons you until you puke. The belief was that forcing him to throw up would push anything harmful out of the body and drive disease out with it, so the king vomited, repeatedly. But when vomiting wasn't enough, the doctors escalated. He was given enemas to empty his bowels, then laxatives, then more enemas. The goal was total evacuation. His digestive system was emptied again and again. Every pathway out of the body had to be cleared. His body was being drained from every direction. Nothing harmful could remain inside. What modern medicine recognizes as dangerous dehydration, they believed was world-class care, because if disease entered the king, it had to leave, even if it took the king with it. What they didn't understand was that they were dangerously dehydrating a man whose organs were already failing. And as the king grew weaker, the treatments became more extreme. When purging failed to restore him, the doctors attempted to burn the illness away, a practice known as counter-irritation. Charles's head was shaved completely. His bare scalp was coated with blistering agents that were designed to raise painful welts and open sores. The belief here was that dangerous humors that were trapped inside the brain could be drawn downward through the body if given a more attractive exit. So they gave him one. Blistering agents were applied to his arms and his legs. His feet were coated with irritating plasters that were meant to pull the illness downward. Some of these mixtures included pigeon droppings, which were strapped to the soles of his feet to pull the sickness as far away from the brain as possible. Charles lay in bed, exhausted, bleeding, and covered in sores, while doctors watched closely for the signs that the humors were moving out of his body. They weren't. So his doctors took things to yet another level. Over the next 4 days, the king swallowed a long list of remedies: herbal waters made from flowers, vinegars and syrups, ground pearls, chemical salts, sacred tinctures, opiates that were meant to calm his body, sweet drinks that were meant to lift his mood. All of it forced into a man who could barely keep his eyes open. As his condition worsened, the treatments became increasingly strange. One physician administered what they called spirit of a human skull. This wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. The liquid was collected from condensation inside the skull of a man who died violently and who had never been buried. This concoction was believed to be especially powerful against seizures. Another treatment involved bezoar stones, hard masses taken from the intestines of goats that were imported from the East Indies. Bezoars were thought to neutralize poison. Ironically, Charles was never even poisoned, until his doctors arrived. Doctors were running out of ideas, so they tried inducing pain as medicine. A red-hot iron was placed against the king's body. It's unclear why. Some believed it would stimulate blood, others thought it might shock the body back into balance. What is clear, though, is that it caused them intense pain. So afterward, Charles was given sugar candy to cheer him up. Pain wasn't considered a problem in early medicine. It was often seen as proof that the treatment was strong enough to work. As the days passed, more doctors crowded into the king's bedchamber. Surgeons, court physicians, and apothecaries all offered advice. More than a dozen physicians crowded the room. Each had his own ideas. Each wanted to be helpful, and no one wanted to be blamed for his death. Instead of slowing down, the king's treatments increased. More blood was taken, more purging followed, more blisters were raised. The king became weaker, yet the doctors continued. No one wanted to admit failure. Even in his terrible condition, Charles had moments of clarity. He apologized to those around him for taking so long to die. He made peace with his wife, Queen Catherine, and he expressed regret for his past behavior. He settled political and personal matters. He spoke very calmly and kindly to those at his bedside. On his deathbed, Charles quietly received Catholic last rites, a secret he'd kept hidden throughout his reign, and the doctors continued their work. His body was exhausted. He was badly dehydrated. He'd lost large amounts of blood. His skin was covered in blisters and burns. His stomach and bowels had been emptied again and again. But on February 6, 1685, 4 days after his collapse, King Charles II died. Today, historians believe King Charles II most likely died from kidney failure, made worse by gout and high blood pressure. These conditions can cause seizures and sudden collapse, but the treatments he received, especially the bloodletting and the purging, would have made recovery almost impossible. The doctors didn't intentionally kill the king. They believed they were trying to save him. And while this story sounds made up, it was meticulously documented, becoming yet another reminder that history is sicker than fiction. This isn't legend. This is sick history.